breeze will be enormously intensified, and you will probably experience an extraordinarily interesting demonstration of the soundness of my more theoretical reasonings. I tested it by myself last week." He waved a bandaged finger at me, and I read a paper to the club on the results. They are very enthusiastic, and have promised their cooperation in the big demonstration I intend to give on next Good Friday. That's 7 weeks off today." He had ceased smoking, but continued to talk quietly in this fashion for the next 35 minutes. The club to which he had referred was a peculiar association of men banded together under the presidentship of Baumoff himself, and having for their appellation the title of, so well as I can translate it, the Believers and Provers of Christ. If I may say so, without any thought of irreverence, they were, many of them, men fanatically crazed to uphold the Christ. You will agree later, I think, that I have not used an incorrect term in describing the bulk of the members of this extraordinary club, which was in its way well worthy of one of the religio-maniacal extrudences which have been forced into temporary being by certain of the more religiously emotional-minded of our cousins across the water. Baumoff looked at the clock, then held out his wrist to me. "Take my pulse," he said. "It's rising fast. Interesting data, you know." I nodded and drew out my watch. I had noticed that his respirations were increasing, and I found his pulse running evenly and strongly at 105. 3 minutes later it had risen to 175, and his respirations to 41. In a further 3 minutes I took his pulse again and found it running at 203, but with the rhythm regular. His respirations were then 49. He had, as I knew, excellent lungs, and his heart was sound. His lungs, I may say, were of exceptional capacity, and there was, at this stage, no marked dyspnea. 3 minutes later I found the pulse to be 227 and the respiration 54. "You've plenty of red corpuscles, Baumoff," I said, "but I hope you're not going to overdo things." He nodded at me and smiled, but said nothing. 3 minutes later, when I took the last pulse, it was 233, and the two sides of the heart were sending out unequal quantities of blood with an irregular rhythm. The respiration had risen to 67 and was becoming shallow and ineffectual, and dyspnea was becoming very marked. The small amount of arterial blood leaving the left side of the heart betrayed itself in the curious bluish and white tinge of the face. "Baumoff," I said, and began to remonstrate, but he checked me with a queerly invincible gesture. "It's all right," he said breathlessly, with a little note of impatience. "I know what I'm doing all the time. You must remember I took the same degree as you in medicine." It was quite true. I remembered then that he had taken his MD in London, and this in addition to 6 other degrees in different branches of the sciences in his own country. And then, even as the memory reassured me that he was not acting in ignorance of the possible danger, he called out in a curious, breathless voice, "The darkness, it's beginning. Take note of every single thing. Don't bother about me. I'm all right." I glanced swiftly round the room. It was as he had said. I perceived it now. There appeared to be an extraordinary quality of gloom growing in the atmosphere of the room, a kind of bluish gloom, vague and scarcely as yet affecting the transparency of the atmosphere to light. Suddenly Baumoff did something that rather sickened me. He drew his wrist away from me and reached out to a small metal box, such as one sterilizes a hypodermic in. He opened the box and took out 4 rather curious-looking drawing pins, I might call them, only they had spikes of steel, fully an inch long, whilst all around the rim of the heads, which were also steel, there projected downward, parallel with the central spike, a number of shorter spikes, maybe 1/8 of an inch long. He kicked off his pumps, then stooped and slipped his socks off, and I saw that he was wearing a pair of linen inner socks. "Antiseptic," he said, glancing at me. "Got my feet ready before you came. No use running unnecessary risks." He gasped as he spoke. Then he took one of the curious little steel spikes. "I've sterilized them," he said, and therewith, with deliberation, he pressed it in, up to the head, into his foot, between the second and third branches of the dorsal artery. "For God's sake, what are you doing?" I said, half rising from my chair. "Sit down," he said, in a grim sort of voice. "I can't have any interference. I want you simply to observe. Keep note of everything. You ought to thank me for the chance instead of worrying me, when you know that I shall go my own way all the time." As he spoke, he had pressed in the second of the steel spikes up to the hilt in his left instep, taking the same precaution to avoid the arteries. Not a groan had come from him. Only his face betrayed the effect of this additional distress. "My dear chap," he said, observing my upsetness, "do be sensible. I know exactly what I'm doing. There simply must be distress, and the readiest way to reach that condition is through physical pain." His speech had become a series of spasmodic words between gasps, and sweat lay in great clear drops upon his lip and forehead. He slipped off his belt and proceeded to buckle it round both the back of his chair and his waist, as if he expected to need some support from falling. "It's wicked," I said. Baumoff made an attempt to shrug his heaving shoulders that was, in its way, one of the most piteous things that I have seen, in its sudden laying bare of the agony that the man was making so little of. He was now cleaning the palms of his hands with a little sponge, which he dipped from time to time in a cup of solution. I knew what he was going to do. And suddenly he jerked out, with a painful attempt to grin, an explanation of his bandaged finger. He had held his finger in the flame of the spirit lamp during his previous experiment, but now, as he made clear in gaspingly uttered sounds, he wished to simulate as far as possible the actual conditions of the great scene that he had so much in mind. He made it so clear to me that we might expect to experience something very extraordinary, that I was conscious of a sense of almost superstitious nervousness. "I wish you wouldn't, Baumoff," I said. "Don't be silly," he managed to say, but the two latter words were more groans than words, for between each he had thrust home, right to the heads in the palms of his hands, the two remaining steel spikes. He gripped his hand shut, with a sort of spasm of savage determination, and I saw the point of one of the spikes break through the back of his hand, between the extensor tendons of the second and third fingers. A drop of blood beaded the point of the spike. I looked at Baumoff's face, and he looked back steadily at me. "No interference," he managed to ejaculate. "I've not gone through all this for nothing. I know what I'm doing. Look, it's coming. Take note. Everything." He relapsed into silence except for his painful gasping. I realized that I must give way, and I stared around the room, with a peculiar commingling of an almost nervous discomfort and a stirring of very real and sober curiosity. "Oh," said Baumoff after a moment's silence. "Something's going to happen, I can tell. Oh, wait till I have my big demonstration. I'll show that brute Houch." I nodded, but I doubt that he saw me, for his eyes had a distinctly interned look. The iris was rather relaxed. I glanced away round the room again. There was a distinct occasional breaking up of the light rays from the lamp, giving a coming and going effect. The atmosphere of the room was also quite plainly darker, heavy with an extraordinary sense of gloom. The bluish tint was unmistakably more in evidence, but there was as yet none of that opacity which we had experienced before upon simple combustion, except for the occasional vague coming and going of the lamplight. Baumoff began to speak again, getting his words out between gasps. This dodge of mine gets the pain into the right place, right association of ideas, emotions. 4. Best results. Follow me? Parallelizing things as much as possible. Fixing whole attention on the death scene. He gasped painfully for a few moments. We demonstrate truth of the darkening, but there's psychic effect to be looked for through results of parallelization of conditions, may have extraordinary simulation of the actual thing. Keep note. Then suddenly, with a clear spasmodic burst, my God, Stafford, keep note of everything. Something's going to happen. Something wonderful. Promise not to bother me. I know what I'm doing. Baumoff ceased speaking with a gasp, and there was only the labour of his breathing in the quietness of the room. As I stared at him, halting from a dozen things I needed to say, I realized suddenly that I could no longer see him quite plainly. A sort of wavering in the atmosphere between us made him seem momentarily unreal. The whole room had darkened perceptibly in the last 30 seconds, and as I stared around I realized that there was a constant invisible swirl in the fast deepening extraordinary blue gloom that seemed now to permeate everything. When I looked at the lamp, alternate flashings of light and blue, darkness followed each other with an amazing swiftness. "My God," I heard Baumoff whispering in the half-darkness as if to himself. "How did Christ bear the nails?" I stared across at him with an infinite discomfort and an irritated pity troubling me, but I knew it was no use to remonstrate now. I saw him vaguely distorted through the wavering tremble of the atmosphere. It was somewhat as if I looked at him through convolutions of heated air, only there were marvellous waves of blue blackness making gaps in my sight. Once I saw his face clearly, full of an infinite pain that was somehow seemingly more spiritual than physical, and dominating everything was an expression of enormous resolution and concentration, making the livid, sweat-damp, agonized face somehow heroic and splendid. And then, drenching the room with waves and splashes of opaqueness, the vibration of his abnormally stimulated agony finally broke up the vibration of light. My last swift glance round showed me, as it seemed, the invisible ether boiling and eddying in a tremendous fashion, and abruptly the flame of the lamp was lost in an extraordinary swirling patch of light that marked its position for several moments, shimmering and deadening, until abruptly I saw neither that glimmering patch of light nor anything else. I was suddenly lost in a black opaqueness of night, through which came the fierce, painful breathing of Baumoff. A full minute passed, but so slowly that if I had not been counting Baumoff's respirations, I should have said that it was 5. Then Baumoff spoke suddenly, in a voice that was somehow curiously changed, a certain toneless note in it. "My God," he said from out of the darkness, "what must Christ have suffered?" It was in the succeeding silence that I had the first realization that I was vaguely afraid.